The golden light crests Mount Hermon, carving long, jagged shadows across the valley floor. It is a morning of absolute stillness until the sky begins to fracture. High above, the clouds peel back, not from wind, but from the sheer force of descent. Massive, winged figures tear through the atmosphere, their forms radiating a heat so intense the air ripples like liquid glass. A group of men working the stone below drops their tools. They shield their eyes, squinting against the blinding, unnatural glare. The sound is not a roar, but a low-frequency hum that vibrates in the marrow of their bones. As the figures touch down, the earth beneath the mountain base heaves. Dust plumes erupt, choking the light, and the ground ripples outward in waves. The men fall back, scrambling for purchase on the shifting soil. They do not speak. They do not run. They are pinned by the weight of the heat and the sight of entities that defy the logic of the horizon. The watchers stand tall, their presence turning the valley into a crucible. The air grows heavy, thick with the scent of ozone and scorched earth. Every breath the men take burns. They watch, trembling, as the figures settle into the landscape. The watchers did not come alone. They brought a legacy that would rewrite the marrow of the world. From the shimmering heat of their arrival, new figures emerged, the Nephilim daughters. They stood among the men, yet they occupied the space differently. Their movements were fluid, lacking the jagged hesitation of human muscle. They walked with a grace that felt like a violation of gravity, their feet barely disturbing the loose dust of the valley floor. When they turned their heads, the light caught their eyes, causing them to glow like dying embers in the deepening twilight. The men who had been working the stone stopped entirely. They reached out, then pulled back, sensing a predator in the stillness. These daughters did not speak, but their presence exerted a physical pressure on the air. Every step they took toward the city was deliberate. The men watched, frozen, as the daughters crossed the threshold of the valley, their glowing gaze marking the beginning of a systematic, global corruption. Deep within the heart of the antediluvian city, the air turned cold and dense. A woman with hair like polished silver sat motionless upon a throne, carved from a single, jagged block of obsidian. She did not look toward the entrance. Her attention was fixed entirely on the basin. Resting at her feet, she held a vial of liquid metal, a substance that pulsed with a rhythm independent of the room. With a steady hand, she tilted the glass. The mercury-like fluid poured out, defying gravity as it coiled into the air before settling into the basin. She traced the surface with a single finger, and the metal responded instantly. It began to shift, folding over itself to form complex, interlocking patterns that defied Euclidean geometry. The liquid glowed with a faint, internal light, casting sharp, shifting reflections against the stone walls. She watched the shapes evolve, her expression unreadable, her focus absolute. This was the knowledge passed down from her celestial father, a blueprint for a new reality. As she manipulated the metal, the temperature in the chamber dropped further, and the stone of the throne began to hum. She was the architect of a new order. The queen stood. The obsidian throne groaned under her weight, then fell silent. She stepped down from the dais, her movements echoing with a rhythmic, metallic click against the stone floor. Outside the chamber, the city square was packed with thousands. They had been waiting in the heat, their faces turned toward the palace entrance. As she emerged, the sound of the city died. It was not a gradual fading. It was an abrupt, violent cessation of all noise. The humans saw her, and their collective reaction was instantaneous. They did not cheer. They did not speak. They dropped to their knees in unison. The sound of thousands of bodies hitting the stone like a single heavy thud. Their faces were pale, drained of blood, eyes wide and fixed on her. There was no joy in their posture, only a rigid, hollow adoration. They trembled, their fingers clawing at the dust, unable to look away yet terrified to look directly into her eyes. She walked through the rows of kneeling figures, and they bowed lower, pressing their foreheads into the dirt. The air grew thick, charged with a static. She stopped before a man kneeling in the front row. He did not look up, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. She reached out, her fingers pressing firmly against the skin of his temple. The contact was brief, yet the effect was immediate. Beneath his skin, a network of faint, glowing lines began to pulse, tracing the path of his veins with a light that matched the liquid metal from her basin. He shuddered, his body arching as if struck by a sudden internal current. The change was not merely superficial. It was a fundamental rewriting of his marrow. Across the square, the phenomenon rippled outward like a wave. Thousands of heads lifted, their eyes reflecting the same unnatural dying ember glow. The air grew heavy with the scent of ozone and something metallic, a byproduct of the biological shift occurring in real time. This was the corruption of all flesh, a systematic encoding of celestial influence into the very bloodlines of the ancient world. The biological landscape of the earth was being permanently altered, cell by cell, generation by generation. The queen watched the transformation, her expression devoid of pity. She was not just ruling a city, she was seeding a new reality. Deep within the temple, the air vibrated with a low, rhythmic hum. Torches lined the walls, their flames burning a sickly, unnatural violet that cast long, distorted shadows across the stone floor. The queen stood before a bronze basin, her hands moving in precise, jagged patterns. Beside her, a king knelt, his crown resting on the cold floor. She poured a viscous, glowing liquid into the basin, and the fumes rose, coiling around the king like living smoke. He did not move. He did not blink. As the vapor touched his skin, his posture stiffened, his jaw locking into a rigid line. The queen whispered a sequence of sounds. The king's eyes glazed over, the pupils dilating until the iris vanished into a dark, empty void. He was no longer a ruler. He was a vessel. She reached out, her palm hovering inches from his forehead, and a spark of white light jumped between them. The king stood, his movements jerky and mechanical. He turned toward the temple exit, his face a mask of hollow obedience. Outside, the city waited. He walked to the balcony, his voice projecting a command. The daughters emerged from the obsidian palace, their presence cutting through the city like a blade. They did not speak, yet the streets fell into a sudden, suffocating silence. Men stopped mid-stride, their tools dropping to the dust. Their eyes locked onto the figures moving through the square. It was not merely physical attraction. It was a biological command. A merchant turned away from his stall, leaving his wares to spill into the mud, his gaze fixed solely on the silver-haired woman as she glided past. He did not blink. He did not breathe. When she brushed past a father holding his child, the man's grip slackened, his fingers uncurling until the infant slipped to the ground, forgotten. He stepped forward, his feet moving in a trance, following the wake of her movement. The daughters moved with a grace that defied the heavy, humid air, their skin radiating a faint, unnatural warmth. Every gesture they made, a tilt of the head, a slow turn of the wrist, acted as a tether, pulling the hearts of men into a tightening knot of devotion. By the time the sun reached its zenith, the city had ceased to function. The markets were empty, the homes abandoned, and the people stood in rows, their faces slack with a terrifying hollow adoration. The fate of the world was sealed, not by war, but by the silent, absolute surrender of every man who looked upon them. Far from the obsidian towers, the air lacked the heavy, intoxicating scent of the city. Noah drove a heavy iron wedge into a beam of cedar, the sound ringing out like a sharp, lonely bell. His palms were thick with calluses, the skin cracked and stained by years of relentless labor. He did not look toward the horizon where the city glowed with a sickly, artificial light. Instead, he kept his eyes on the grain of the wood. He ran a thumb over the surface, checking for knots, for weaknesses, for any sign of rot. Beside him, his sons moved in silence, their movements steady and deliberate, lacking the hypnotic, fluid grace of the hybrid daughters. Noah paused, his breath hitching, as he felt a faint, rhythmic vibration in the ground, a tremor that did not belong to the earth. He pressed his ear to the timber, listening for the marrow-deep corruption that had already claimed the world. It was not there. He exhaled, his shoulders dropping, and gripped the handle of his mallet again. He was a filter, a wall, a final boundary. He checked the lineage of his family, watching their eyes for the telltale glow, searching their skin for the shimmer of the watchers. He found only the dust of the earth and the sweat of honest work. The shift did not happen in the sky alone. It started in the lungs. The air grew thick, heavy with the sharp, metallic tang of ozone that made the back of the throat ache. Noah stopped his work, his hand frozen on the hammer, as the light began to drain from the horizon. The sun, once a source of warmth, became a pale, sickly disk struggling against a rising tide of violet. Above the valley, the clouds curdled into a bruised, deep purple that seemed to press down on the earth with physical weight. Birds stopped their song, their wings folding as they plummeted into the tall grass, silent and still. The livestock in the pens began to pace, their hooves clattering against the dry earth in a frantic, uneven rhythm. Nature was recoiling, pulling back from the surface of the world as if preparing to hold its breath. The silence that followed was absolute. Noah looked up, his eyes tracing the darkening expanse, seeing the finality etched into the bruised clouds. The reckoning had arrived. The pressure in the air reached a breaking point. A taut wire stretched until it hummed with the weight of the coming deluge. Noah stood motionless, his fingers tracing the rough, dry grain of the timber. The earth beneath his feet was a map of cracks, a parched landscape that had forgotten the feeling of moisture. He watched a single, jagged fissure in the dirt, his eyes narrowing as the atmosphere seemed to buckle. Then it happened. A single heavy drop of water struck the dust. It did not soak in. It shattered, leaving a dark, perfectly circular crater in the parched clay. Noah looked up, his face tilted toward the bruised, plum-colored clouds. Another drop struck the wooden frame, the sound echoing like a hammer against hollow bone. Then a third, landing on his upturned palm. It was cold, unnaturally so, carrying the chill of the upper atmosphere down to the dying world. The ground began to darken, pockmarked by the rhythmic, relentless arrival of the rain. The hybrid empire stood silent in the distance. The sky did not just open, it collapsed. The rhythmic tapping of the first drops vanished, replaced by a roar that drowned out the wind and the silence alike. Water fell in sheets, a solid gray curtain that turned the dry, cracked earth into a churning, liquid abyss. The ground, long parched, could not absorb the violence of the deluge. It surged, turning into a thick, swirling slurry that pulled at the roots of the trees and the foundations of the stone walls. Noah watched from the shelter of his work, his hands gripping the wood as the world outside dissolved into a chaotic, gray blur. The great city, once a monument of obsidian and pride, shuddered. The heavy, carved stones of the lower plazas began to shift, sliding into the rising tide like loose teeth. A low, grinding sound rose from the earth, the noise of ancient masonry losing its grip on the mud. Walls cracked, then buckled, their weight pulling them down into the dark, frothing water. The streets became rivers, carrying away the debris of a civilization that had believed itself eternal. There was no resistance, only the relentless, rising tide that sought to erase every trace of the hybrid order. The valley floor was gone, replaced by a vast, churning sea that swallowed the horizon. The foundations of the world were failing. High above the churning chaos, the Nephilim daughter stood on the edge of her obsidian balcony. The wind whipped the air, carrying the scent of ozone and crushed stone. She looked out at the horizon, where the sky and the sea had merged into a single, suffocating wall of gray. Below, the city was already a memory, its towers sinking into the rising, frothing tide. She raised a hand, fingers splayed toward the sky. Attempting to command the elements as she had done for centuries, she reached into the marrow of her being, calling upon the celestial power that once made the air shimmer at her command. But the rain did not part, the water did not recoil. Instead, it surged upward, a relentless, cold wall of liquid that defied her will. Her palm remained empty, the air biting and indifferent. She felt the sudden, sharp realization that the hybrid code within her was no longer a source of authority. The obsidian palace, once the seat of a new order, groaned under the weight of the encroaching sea. The water did not merely flood the halls, it acted with the precision of a blade, scouring the stone clean of every trace of the hybrid rain. Inside the throne room, the basin that once held the liquid metal patterns shattered as the floor tilted into the abyss. The water surged over the dais, extinguishing the flickering torches and drowning the very air that had sustained the cults. Every corner of the structure was filled with a churning, gray tide, a violent reset that tore through the foundations of the ancient city. The architecture, engineered to defy geometry and natural law, buckled under the relentless pressure of the deluge. Walls of obsidian cracked and dissolved. The symbols of authority, the altars, and the artifacts of sorcery were swept into the dark, frothing depths, buried under layers of silt and debris. As the last spire vanished beneath the waves, the palace was silenced forever, leaving behind only the cold, indifferent expanse of the rising sea. Deep beneath the surface, the last echoes of the cults were extinguished. The water moved with a heavy rhythmic force, pressing against the ruins of the temples and the remnants of the sorcery that had once steered the ancient world. Where there had been chanting and the flicker of torches, there was now only the slow, crushing weight of the sea. The biological landscape, once altered by the hybrid influence, was being systematically scrubbed clean. Every stone altar, every relic of the old order, was tumbled by the current, until it was nothing more than sediment. The water acted as a filter, pulling the corruption into the dark, lightless depths. There was no resistance left. The sorcery that had enslaved kings dissolved into the brine, its potency neutralized by the sheer, overwhelming volume of the deluge. The world above had vanished, replaced by a churning gray abyss that stretched from horizon to horizon. The reset was absolute. The deluge eventually exhausted its fury. The waters, once a churning abyss, began their slow retreat, pulling back from the high ground, to expose a world stripped of its former architecture. Where the obsidian palace had stood, there was only a vast, sodden basin of silt and broken stone. The silence that followed was heavy, not with the absence of life, but with the weight of an unresolved ending. As the mud dried under a pale, emerging sun, the question surfaced like debris in the wake of a storm. The flood had purged the cities and silenced the sorcery, but had it truly reached the marrow of the survivors? The focus shifted to the small group that remained. Among the lineages that persisted, the wives of the sons of Noah stood as the final, unexamined variable. Researchers and observers across the ages would return to this moment, tracing the lines of descent with meticulous, trembling hands. They looked for the markers, the subtle deviations in the blood that suggested the Watcher influence had not been washed away by the tide. The genetic code, once thought to be completely excised, remained a ghost in the machine of human history. It was a haunting possibility that the purge had failed to reach the deepest, most hidden layers of the human story. The mystery of the hybrid legacy lingered. The centuries passed, burying the secrets of the deluge beneath layers of shifting, sun-scorched sand. In the modern era, the silence of the desert was broken by the rhythmic strike of steel against stone. Explorers moved across the dunes, guided by anomalies in the ground-penetrating radar that suggested something vast lay hidden below. They dug with precision, removing the grit of millennia to reach the hardened strata of an older world. The heat shimmered off the excavation site, distorting the horizon as they descended into the dark, cool interior of a buried tomb. The air inside was stale, untouched by the winds that had reshaped the surface. As they cleared the final obstruction, the beam of a flashlight cut through the gloom, landing on the remains of a figure that had been interred with deliberate care. The bones were not merely large, they were structured with a geometry that defied the known human record. The femur, thick and dense, suggested a frame that could not have been supported by normal anatomy. These were the physical evidence of a lineage that had once walked the earth. The brush moved in slow, methodical arcs, clearing the final layer of sediment from the cranium. As the dirt fell away, the shape beneath the soil became undeniable. It was not the rounded, familiar dome of a human skull. The brow ridge was heavy, protruding with a jagged, unnatural slope, while the back of the cranium extended into a ridge. The researchers leaned in, the silence of the tomb amplifying the sound of their own breathing. They measured the circumference. The numbers did not align with any known biological record. A cold, sharp realization settled in the room. The findings were moved from the desert site to the quiet, sterile atmosphere of research halls. There, the data projected onto screens sparked debate. The experts argued over carbon dates and genetic markers, but the underlying tension was palpable. It was a profound, existential dread. The skulls sat on the tables, heavy and silent, serving as physical evidence that the world had once held beings who were not of the human lineage. The physical evidence of the bones did not remain confined to the research halls. It bled into the collective memory of humanity, manifesting as the persistent, haunting whispers of the Nephilim daughters. These figures, once flesh and blood, evolved into the sirens of the deep and the goddesses of ancient pantheons. Their influence did not vanish with the flood. It was encoded into the very structure of human folklore. Sailors spoke of voices that could steer ships toward jagged rocks, and kings carved statues of women whose gaze seemed to command the tides. These were not inventions of the imagination. They were the distorted echoes of a hybrid lineage that had once held dominion over the earth. The ruins scattered across the globe serve as the final, silent witnesses to this era. Every broken pillar and weathered stone carving acts as a warning as the wind whistles through these ancient, empty temples. It carries the weight of a history that refuses to be forgotten. The silence of the stars feels heavy. The myths are the last remaining map of a world that was almost lost, etched into the bedrock of human civilization. They stand as a testament to a power that once defied the natural order. The search for the Nephilim daughters ends not in the desert, but in the laboratory. We map the double helix, tracing the sequence of our own existence, and find gaps that defy simple explanation. These markers sit in the dark corners of our genetic code, silent passengers from a forgotten era. We look at the data on our screens and wonder if the legacy of the Watchers is still encoded within us. It is a terrifying possibility that the hybrid bloodline did not vanish, but merely retreated into the marrow of the human race. The silence of the stars offers no answers, only the cold, indifferent reflection of our own curiosity. We are the final, living archives of a world that was almost erased. The history of the earth is written in our blood, and the ink is still wet. The puzzle is not finished.